Purity of Elements, an aura that was originally known as Purity, was once the most powerful aura in Path of Exile. And in the 11 years since it was first released, it's undergone a lot of changes. Originally, Purity gave you 5% to all maximum elemental resistances, in addition to granting elemental resistances, all at a 35% mana reservation. This version of Purity was incredibly overpowered, thus it got nerfed. The elemental purities of Ice, Fire, and Lightning were added to grant the maximum resistances instead, and Purity was renamed to Purity of Elements to reflect the difference. If you want to know a little bit more about why 5% to all maximum elemental resistances is so powerful, please get subscribed, as I'm going to be releasing a complete guide to resistances in Path of Exile in the near future. It's going to be a resource where hopefully both beginners and veterans alike can learn something as they watch it. But with that history lesson aside, why should you be using Purity of Elements in your League Start build? First off, because Purity of Elements is a great defensive aura which can help to shore up holes in your build that often arise from having poor gear at League Start, especially while you're leveling during the acts. If you need damage, this won't really be the right answer for you. But if you find yourself dying too much, or struggling to cap resistances, then Purity of Elements could very well be your new best friend. So to start out with, what exactly does it do? Purity of Elements is an aura that reserves 50% of your maximum mana to grant you 20 to 34% to all elemental resistances and render you and nearby allies immune to elemental ailments. I know that 50% of your maximum mana does sound like quite a lot, but if you're able to grab aura nodes such as Charisma or Sovereignty, along with the Aura Mastery for 15% mana reservation efficiency, it should be pretty easy to fit this in, even during the acts. And while you're leveling, getting 20% to all elemental resistances with a level 1 Purity of Elements is no joke. The gem is available from Clarissa in Act 3 for all classes. While I don't necessarily advise putting it on quite that early, if you have a Purity of Elements ready to go for once you beat Katava in Act 5, this is great, because it will counteract a majority of the negative 30% all resistance penalty he inflicts. This is especially important because many of the monsters in Act 6 deal dangerous amounts of elemental damage, in particular fire damage. Now, it should be noted this does not help you against chaos damage. The wording is very specific here. It says all elemental resistances, which refers to fire resistance, cold resistance, and lightning resistance, but will not protect you from chaos resistance. So do keep that in mind, and maybe grab an amethyst flask. The last thing about Purity of Elements that makes it so great is you don't have to worry as much about your flasks. Generally when I'm leveling, I want to have an anti-bleed flask and an anti-freeze flask as soon as I can. But if I'm running Purity of Elements, I'll already be completely immune to being frozen. So I only need to worry about bleed, which means I can use that other suffix for something like move speed, anti-poison, or maybe armor or evasion. And even once you get into mapping or endgame, ignites, shocks, and brittle can be especially dangerous ailments these days. They're inflicted by arch-nemesis monsters, by bosses such as Cirrus, or, more dangerously, by almost everything that comes out of an altar if you click the wrong mod. So Purity of Elements might not be a permanent part of your build. There are other ways to get resistances and ailment immunity later on, but it's an invaluable tool at League Start, especially if you're struggling to cap your resistances and you want to save resources rather than rolling your flasks to fix those problems. And just because you don't have to use it in the endgame doesn't mean you can't. There are plenty of builds that I've played, including at quite high investment, where Purity of Elements was simply the best option available. It kind of all comes down to your setup. Now, next up, I'm going to be talking a little bit about my own experiences using Purity of Elements and my own experiences leveling and running into the problems that the aura solves. Before I do though, if you found this video to be helpful or informative, then be sure to give it a like. If you want to see more content after this, including how other mechanics work in Path of Exile, click through the card, or maybe check out my second channel, 10 Gaming Thoughts, where I talk about gaming news and other topics related to gaming and game design. A special thanks to my patrons and YouTube channel members for the continued support, but more about how you can do that at the end. For now, what are my experiences with Purity of Elements, and what are some builds where you might not want to run it? Well, I wouldn't say they're necessarily builds so much as ascendancies. There's two ascendancies which come to mind that don't necessarily benefit as much from running Purity of Elements. For many people, it is a great choice, but if you're starting as a Necromancer and you're already grabbing Commander of Darkness early on, you're not getting nearly as much benefit, since Commander of Darkness will be giving you a significant amount of resistances. Similarly, if you're a Saboteur with Pyromaniac, you're already getting a lot of recovery, along with complete immunity to ignite and shock. So again, you're not really getting as much value from Purity of Elements, and it's probably better to pick it up later or not use it at all, since mana is a valuable resource. For most other builds, I find that right around Act 5 is a prime time to put on Purity of Elements. You can use it this way to counteract the resistance penalty from defeating Kitava. And maybe your gear's great coming out of Act 5. Then think about Act 10. You're defeating Kitava again, and you're getting another resistance penalty, so this could be a good time to put on Purity of Elements. Now, I'm not the best at leveling, so oftentimes my gear isn't up to par. I'll have items with life on them, the links and colors I want, but usually I won't be capped on all of my resistances. And in the past, I've neglected to run Purity of Elements nearly as often as I should. So I spend more time worrying about my gear, I waste some resources rolling my flasks, and I die more than I need to. Speaking of flasks, I'm very bad at proactively using non-life flasks these days. I blame the fact that I use Instilling Orbs on all my flasks as soon as I can, and then just never think about them again. Don't get me wrong, Instilling Orbs are great, and my hands have certainly thanked me, but it also means that now I'm pretty bad at using flasks manually. Maybe I'm just getting old, or maybe it's an out of sight, out of mind kind of thing. But if I'm running Purity of Elements, then I won't have to worry about the fact that I forgot to hit my anti-freeze flask, or my anti-shock flask, and I'll never burn to death because I didn't hit my dousing flask. One of the things that I found the most problematic in 3.18 was during my early mapping on my Corrupting Fever Gladiator, I wasn't fully ailment immune. I had about 70% chance to avoid elemental ailments, which means I needed to solve freeze, or I'd have a 30% chance to die to freeze. And while it didn't kill me very often, there were times where I'd fight a rare and get ignited and take a lot of damage or die. And when I did a map with shocked ground, it was very dicey. A lot of this came down to my own greed. I made really awesome boots that almost capped my chance to avoid ailments, but it didn't go quite far enough, and then I had really bad luck with Ashling and fixing the body armor. So the lesson here is, I shouldn't have made the boots as early as I did. I should have just slapped Purity of Elements on, and it would have been fine. On the other hand, during 3.17, I played a Righteous Fire Inquisitor, and Purity of Elements was part of my setup all the way through the endgame. This was important to me because I was using Melding of the Flesh, so resistances were already a bit tight. So Purity of Elements went a long way to counteracting the resistance penalty from Melding of the Flesh. But more importantly, it meant that I didn't have to worry about ailments, and I wanted a build that could pretty much face tank everything in the game, so I didn't want to have to worry about the fact that that monster over there can scorch me, thus reducing my fire res, thus making me burn myself to death. After all, Scorch capped out at around 30, and going down from 90% fire res to 60 would not be a good time. I thought about playing a Righteous Fire Raider, but as much as that rolls off the tongue, it probably wouldn't be a very good build in Path of Exile. So, if you can't give up your boots, you're not playing a Raider, and you want all the nice quality of life that comes from being completely immune to elemental ailments, Purity of Elements is a great choice and will save you a lot of deaths. But now I'm curious, have you ever used Purity of Elements? Maybe it's already part of your League Start plan. Or are you now going to shove it into whatever build you decide to start? Let me know your thoughts, along with any other auras, skill gems, or items that you consider to be invaluable for League Start. A special thanks to my patrons and YouTube channel members. Your support helps keep me independent and allows me to turn down things like sketchy mobile game sponsorships. You can do so for as low as $1 a month over on Patreon, or if you want to support me completely for free, then you can join the community by hopping into my Discord, link below. If you want more content, check out my second channel, 10 Gaming Thoughts. It's a place that I use to review games, ramble my way through video essays, and a lot more. Or of course, you can just click the suggested video in the card right now. I hope you learned something today, and maybe I'll see you again sometime soon.